What's up guys, also Footballtalk here, back with another NFL draft video. We just watched the scouting combine take place at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis this past week, and as is the case every year, some guys helped themselves with their performances, while others didn't so much. So my idea here was to go through each position and outline one name that I think is on the rise, and another that is falling right now. Of course that's all relative to what draft boards look like at this stage, but the way I approached this was, how did my perception of these draft prospects change, and to some degree, how do I think their performances will affect how NFL teams perceive them? Looking at consensus boards with a reference point in that regard, and if there are other notable performances at those positions, I do have a few words to bring up along the way. We've got a beefy episode ahead, so let's get straight to it. And since the NFL mixed things up a bit themselves this year, we will start on the defensive side of the ball, in particular the interior defensive line. And considering he's been falling seemingly in this pre-draft process without any further information, other than people connected to NFL front offices saying he's not as highly touted as some may think, I'm happy to show Clemson's Brian Brzee some love here, after a very challenging year off and to some degree on the field as well. Brzee weighed in just 2 pounds shy of the 300 mark, yet still he ran a 4.86 in the 40, which was 4th among the interior defensive line group, and he was between 7 and 17 pounds heavier than all three of those guys ahead of him, plus his 171 10-yard split was tied for second. Other than that, he only did the vertical jump and bench press, where he was top 8 in both marks, but it was his on-field workout that really impressed me. He looked very light on his feet, with no wasted movement going for the back drills, turning a tight corner as he was sinking his hands and hips together. His hands were very quick and forceful, plus towards the end, when they were asked to string together multiple moves, unlike this D-line gauntlet, he stayed tight to the bags, even on a compact spin move, which that isn't necessarily a portion of the workout that favors bigger guys, where somebody like Brzee at 6'5.5" had to actively reduce his frame. I'd be remiss to not bring up Pittsburgh's Kalijah Kancey, basically showing the exact same athletic profile as another former Panther and 3-time Defensive Player of the Year in Aaron Donald, with a 4.67 40 and 1.64 split, but he didn't do anything else. And 4.85 with a 1.72 split is a great time for West Virginia's Dante Stills at 286 pounds. After murdering people at the Shrine Bowl, he continues to look explosive in his movements and the way he plants off his foot to change directions, navigating through the bags without losing any balance at any point. And his ability to dip that shoulder and effortlessly execute the figure 8 on the run the hoop drill was also very impressive for his height. And in the theme of this video, somebody has to be in a negative end here, which for me, Penn State's PJ Mustipher simply did not help himself in Indy. He had the worst 40 time of any defensive player for the week at a 5'1", despite 3 of the 4 guys directly in front of him having about 15 pounds on his 320. And the 1.88 10-yard split might be even worse, which was tied for the slowest mark with Baylor's fridge-like Siaki Ika. Mustipher was tied for the 3rd worst vertical jump, and he had the shortest broad, just hitting 8 feet. And I don't even know who advised him to do the agility drills, since he was dead last in both as well, going over the 8 and 5 second marks respectively for the free cone and short shuttle. Along with that, Mustipher was high in his movements on the field during the wave drill and others. He looked rather sloppy in his transitions, sort of pausing at times almost as if he didn't want to slip later on. For a guy who I think was a pretty integral piece to a great Penn State defense these last few years, but had very little production, not reaching more than 1 sack in any of his 4 seasons as a starter, this really isn't good. Texas's Keandre Coburn looked like a big body who we can put in the middle of a defense for a couple of downs maybe, but there's nothing athletically that excites you at all. Showed tightness in his ankles and didn't lift his feet off the ground or plant it off them very well. He really is what he is, just a space eater. Now moving on to the edge position, and let's get to the main event here now. And there'll be guys higher up in terms of people throwing out combine risers or whatever, but nobody else throughout last week impressed me more personally than Northwestern's Adetumiwa Adubawari. Let me approach it this way. Last year, people went nuts when Teron Walker killed the combine, and hype got so much that he ended up going first overall to the Jaguars. Adi ran a 4.49 in the 40 with a 1.61 split, a 37.5-inch vert, and a 10.5 broad jump. Those are all better than Walker, despite weighing 10 pounds more at 282. He didn't do the agility drills, but he did put up 27 reps on the bench press with basically 34-inch arms. This guy was zooming through the bags on the ground and seemed to have no issues changing directions, actually better than Justin Power with some of the pure edge guys, who he outweighed by 30 to 40 pounds a lot of them. That ability to snap his hips as he's making those 90-degree turns and swiping by the bags, and how glued he was to the dummies on the D-line gauntlet to not get off track at all was great to see. Like, even doing the off-ball linebacker drills, he looked better than a lot of guys who won't play with their hand in the dirt more often than not. It was just a ridiculous showcase, and after already impressing at the Senior Bowl, I think he has a legit chance of sneaking into the back end of round 1. Iowa's Lucas Van Ness deserves to be mentioned here, 4'5'8" in the 40 at 272 pounds, way too smooth than he should be for his size, and has some real snap in his hands. He was also behind only Eastern Michigan's Jose Ramirez among edge defenders in the free cone and the short shuttle to showcase his lateral agility, considering he was very much a pure power player at Iowa. Both Georgia outside linebackers Nolan Smith and Robert Beal obviously were very impressive as well, with Smith's 4.39 being one of the fastest times we've ever seen from an edge guy, I think actually second all time. Now let's get back to the negative side, and as I mentioned at the top here, I did label these guys by what they played in college and how they are typically listed on different boards, which is Florida A&M's Isaiah Land making an appearance here for this edge group. For how much lighter he was than pretty much everybody else listed at defensive end, at 236 pounds, I needed him to run a great time, yet he was just about average with a 4.62, and so was his 1.65 10-yard split. I thought there wasn't much pop in his hands, and he got too wide when he should have tightly navigated around the bags. The NFL probably looks at Land as an off-ball linebacker mostly anyway, but even then, the athleticism isn't anything beyond the standard that would make him super appealing. And he was probably even helped a little bit by working out with guys that typically will have their hand in the dirt and weren't quite as clean doing the back drills as if he was labeled with the true linebackers. Which we saw a bunch of legit edge guys, such as Alabama's Will Anderson, be a part of that group, and will definitely look better during the on-field drills. The only positive of Land's performance was the 10-6 broad jump. I guess some of the buzz around him coming out of the Senior Bowl will now vanish mostly. And my god, the stock of Army's Andre Carter just continues to drop. With some of the strength questions I already had, 11 reps on the bench press, and a 9-1 broad jump, both dead last for the group, plus not even cracking 34-inch arms at 6'6.5", when the calling card for him really was length. That's just rough. However, we move on to the second level, and back to the positive side. I could of course go with one of the true freak athletes here at the linebacker spot, in Auburn's own Papo, or Clemson's Trenton Simpson running 4.39 and 4.43 respectively in the 40, along with surprisingly two of the best marks in the bench press, but we knew coming into the week that they'd be freakishly fast at least. So based on my expectations, I was more impressed with Duke's Shaka Hayward. For a pretty good inside thumper, Hayward running a 4.53 right around the NFL average size of 235 pounds was a great time for him. You combine that with measuring at 6'3 with 34-inch arms, and you see the tools to be a matchup asset in coverage, which I already was pretty impressed with at these first shrine practices. He looked very smooth in the coverage drills, redirecting with the shuffle, staying low in his paddle, and quickly sticking his foot in the ground to drive forwards when taking directions on the wave drill. His hips looked loose, and he snatched the ball away from his body on multiple occasions when asked to open and pivot. For a guy that was labeled as a below-average athlete, who may have problems changing directions due to his longer legs, I think he had a very positive showing in the linebacker class without much clarity. Tennessee's Jeremy Banks and Washington State's Dan Henley also ran well and made up good ground in on-field drills while still cleanly getting out of the transitions. Henley in particular was so tight in his change of direction, not taking any unnecessary steps or having any delay on those, and Banks will be one of my biggest draft crushes, just continuing to tick boxes after I thought he had a tremendous Shrine Bowl week already himself. And Jack Campbell out of Iowa is a guy with some of the cleanest tape you'll find in terms of processing the game from the second level and letting his eyes take him to the ball. Even though the 4.65 in the 40 isn't great, to easily have the best agility drills of the group at 6'5", 250 pounds, so true old school size for a linebacker, that's outstanding for him. As we get back to the other side of the spectrum, there was far less of an obvious choice. I wouldn't say there weren't any linebackers who really stood out in a positive sense, but at least there wasn't really anybody running in the 4.7s or have any other really bad measurements. Since I do have to talk about somebody here, I went with Purdue's Jalen Graham. First of all, he ran the third slowest 40 time among linebackers at 4.64, despite coming in at only 220 pounds. That's a bit of a red flag already. And his 10-yard split of 1.68 was 0.6 of a second worse than anybody else from that group. Then he also had the weakest jumps at 30.5 inches in the vert and just a 9-4 broad. Moreover, he just seemed to be straining when changing directions doing the on-field stuff, and he looked really sloppy going through the back drills, when you'd like to see him properly step around/over them, and all those time when he touched down on the bags. He also body caught the ball and stumbled trying to work around the bags off the hand swipe moves. So at that weight, no way you can think about making him a safety, which is what I think he was originally recruited as. And what is a positive of using him as a dime backer when he doesn't look good in those areas you'd sub him in for in place of heavier bodies? Some team is gonna have to fall in love with his value on special teams, I believe. Let's move on to the corner group now though, and my god, this class was outstanding, which I called for the day of them getting onto the field. And I had a tough time even picking one here, but the name I ultimately settled on was Deontay Banks from Maryland. At 6 foot even and 197 pounds, Banks ran a 4.35 in the 40, was number 1 among all corners with a 42-inch vert, and second in the raw jump at 11.4. He didn't do the agility drills or bench, but he also had an excellent on-field workout, where he stayed low in his pedal, was able to drive out of it with explosion, and flip his hips without issues, despite the longer build, and he didn't have any drops to his resume. Banks did T-step a little bit in the W drill, which I personally don't like to see, but that is more so about what guys are getting coached to do in college. Meanwhile, he caught the ball with confidence, and only counted 1 drop during the gauntlet as well. This is one of the deeper corner classes that I've ever evaluated, but some guys have to go early, and when I combine his performance with his tape, Banks certainly feels like a first rounder to me, so lock him into your mocks. And of course we have to bring up Banks' former running mate at corner, in Jacorian Bennett, who actually bested his guy with a 4.3 flat in the 40, top 4 marks in both the jumps, and a good on-field workout. At the same time, Oregon's Christian Gonzalez may have separated himself from the trio of corners at the top based on consensus rankings, in the eyes of some teams with a tremendous all-around performance in testing and on-field drills. Julius Brents from Kansas State, meanwhile, absolutely jumped out the gym with a 41-inch vert and an 11.6 broad jump, and while not all corners did participate, his agility numbers were also both significantly better than the next closest corner. For a guy at the legit 6'3 with 34-inch arms, that'll be very intriguing to NFL teams. Rotating back to the negative end of the spectrum, there was Texas A&M's Jalen Jones, who had the second worst 40 time among all corners at 4.57, despite his 10-yard split at 1.48, being tied for the second best among the group. So that kind of confirms what I thought about him, being able to drive on stuff in front of him and be a physical cover 2 corner, but his deep speed is a real issue, and it limits what he can be at the next level. The jumps were okay, but I didn't like what I saw on the field either. He was trying to T-step early in the W drill, but slipped twice in the first break, and that was a bit timid when he did finally make it through the drill. And he slipped a bit again when they were trying to simulate a curl to pivot route, I guess, where they have to open one way and then make that full 180-degree turn. I will give him credit for the way that he caught the ball, and maybe there was some bad choice simply with the footwear, but there's too many really good corners in this group to have a performance like that. It's just not going to cut it, and he's going to be a scheme-specific player where a team has to buy into special teams value to bring him in sometime on day 3. Also, Virginia's Anthony Johnson was rough in the testing. He was dead last with a 4.63 in the 40, the vert at 30.5 inches, and just an inch away from the very bottom of the list with a 9.7 broad jump. As far as safety goes, there's a couple of names that look pretty good, but none quite made noise like Illinois' Jatavius Martin. He absolutely jumped out the gym as well. His 44-inch vert ties him for the 4th best all-time for any position, and he also led the safety group with an 11.1 broad jump, along with being just 300 off the top mark in the 40 at 4.46. During the on-field drills, I thought he covered good ground and had a couple of nice high punt grabs. Watching him go through the W and one of the other transition drills, I thought the foot fire to change directions was really impressive too, and he did get out of the gauntlet clean without any drops at the end of the session. I did like Martin from the limited tape that I watched on him, but I was mostly tracking him while studying his teammate Sidney Brown and DeJuan Witherspoon, who I both absolutely adore. I'll have to go back to the tape for him specifically and see if I make like his skill sets to play more in the post with those kinds of explosive numbers, along with already being a very effective slot for the Illini. Martin's former teammate Sidney Brown, of course, had an excellent performance himself, with top-level testing numbers and a smooth workout, and Cal Daniel Scott, I thought, had a really nice performance as well, in terms of the testing and how loose his hips looked like. As far as a fall on the safety position, I really can only talk about Brandon Joseph from Notre Dame here. With his 4.62 in the 40, he was tied for the 4th slowest time among safeties, and 2 of the 3 guys he finished ahead of I would certainly define as box safeties or big nickels, not somebody who people looked at as a potential first rounder, as a true center fielding free safety just a couple of years ago still at Northwestern. I didn't think Joseph was making up a whole lot of ground when having his hips flipped and trying to gain depth, and for somebody whose calling card was range and his ball skills, having 4 passes go off his hands during the drills, that's just unacceptable. That's not including the gauntlet, where he did thankfully catch every ball, but the pure speed, the ability to make up ground when his body isn't fully committed, and the lack of security hauling in passes will definitely cost him. Flores Trey Dean running a 4.75, worst among all defensive backs, of course limits what teams project him as at the next level, but I think he was looked at as a tight end matchup player or down safety anyway, and for his size, he was able to flip and run really well, along with making some tremendous grabs, plus he wrapped off a DB best 25 on the bench press. And that is us moving on to the offensive side of the ball. We're first up with the quarterbacks. Really all 3 of the top 4 quarterbacks who decided to throw, not including Alabama's Bryce Young, who just won by showing up with the exact same measurements basically as another former first overall pick in Kyler Murray, which we all know isn't going to be the weight that he ultimately plays at, but that's a different story. All 3 of those other guys look pretty good out there. Ohio State's C.J. Stroud in particular just made everything look so easy and effortless, with a solid base, smooth release, and great ball placement, while Kentucky's Will Levis had great zip on the ball throughout his workout and was very calm in his footwork because he was comfortable hanging at the top of his drop and showing off his self-proclaimed cannon, even though I think he could have showcased it more actually. But how can I not talk about Flores Anthony Richardson here? The athletic testing is just stupid. A 4.43 in the 40, a 40.5-inch vert, and a 10.9 broad jump at 244 pounds. Are you kidding me? Those marks are significantly better than Cam Newton, who at least body type wise seems like a close comparison. Along with that, just the power behind his release, the flick of the wrist being so easy to him, driving the ball on shake routes and speed outs towards the sideline, and then the showcase throws on the go balls, where he let it fly 65 yards through the air with pace. It was really fun to watch. And while there are certainly questions on tape, I think many people have undersold what Richardson has shown already with just over 1 season of starting experience, and there have to be several teams very intrigued with the idea of a freak like AR-15. I would not be shocked if he ends up going as high as number 2 overall, and no chance he makes it out of the top 9. There's really only so much you can do to hurt your stock as a quarterback, jumping and running around in underpants before throwing routes versus air to receivers you've never linked up with. But if there was one guy who definitely didn't help himself, it would be TCU's Max Duggan. He did actually run a 4.52 in the 40, which was second best to only Richardson, but other than that, he had the worst or second worst mark in all the other testing metrics, and I have to question why he even participated in all of them. I thought he also was a bit safe with his throws, forcing receivers to turn for the ball at the sidelines, or slowing down on deep balls, in order to get the completions, but that's not really what the coaches, GMs and scouts want to see in Indy. It's about the ability to put the ball to a spot where defenders won't be able to make a play on it. Just watching the first 3 slants that he threw, they all came out different. Once low, then high, and finally slightly behind the target. He's not the most consistent guy in terms of the mechanics, and he already missed a chance to stand out during the Senior Bowl week. I'm not going to act like Richardson was perfect, and what we saw from him and Duggan in terms of their legs going later on a little bit maybe, because they were doing all the testing stuff, that's definitely something to be aware of, but at least we saw how easy the Florida quarterback was able to flick it, in contrast to Duggan earlier. We're moving on to the wide receiver position, and a guy that I've shouted on multiple occasions this offseason already, Liberty's Demario Douglas. We already knew he was small, and at 5'8", 179 pounds, we needed to see him stand out to some degree athletically, which he did. That 4.44 in the 40 matches his game speed. He displayed a nice burst out of his breaks, confidently caught the ball during the gauntlet, and had a great diving grab on a deep in-cut once. You saw him smoothly and rapidly turning upfield after securing the catch consistently, and he looked like a guy who all of that comes to pretty naturally. Douglas was also tied for 5th among wide receivers with a 39.5-inch vert and just 1 inch behind the top mark in the broad jump at 10.8. You take that along with how he was cooking the bees throughout East-West Shrine Week, which I already outlined for him in an article on the biggest standouts from the college all-star events, and he's probably moved up significantly on a lot of boards around the league during this process as somebody who, because of the physical measurements, will probably be available on day 3, but he may go a lot earlier than expected once the 22 season ended. Ohio State's Jackson Smith-Njigba didn't run the 40, but he put up elite agility numbers, which are tops at the entire event across all positions, while also being 2 and 3/10 of a second better than anybody else for the wide receiver group respectively. And he just looked so smooth during the on-field portion, fluid route running, adjusting to the ball, and getting upfield effortlessly. He kind of reminded people that he's still part of this class. and two of the bigger receivers in Princeton's Andre Yoshivas and West Virginia's Bryce Ford Wheaton ran better than expected, along with the former finishing behind only Smith and Jigba in terms of the agility drills, while the latter was tied for the group's top mark with a 40-inch vert. Meanwhile, Maryland's Dante Demas was pretty far down the list with a 5.47 in the 40, but I just didn't like the way he moved on the field, to be honest. He lacked juice in his routes and wasn't crisp at all in his breaks. He struggled catching the ball cleanly a couple of times early on, even though he was able to get that done as the workout continued. But his play speed is questionable going up against NFL defensive backs, and that's what I wasn't sure about watching his tape either. It's obviously not his role, as he was a pure outside receiver at Maryland, but watching him run the pivot routes, it was more so a shuffle into the cut rather than exploding off that inside foot. You'll see some tightness be clean in those transitions. To me, with the athletic profile confirming most of what I saw on tape, I just look at him as a limited player, who may have his role as a red zone specialist, where his ability to catch the ball through contact and position his body accordingly is very good, but other than that, he's a pure outside receiver with a very small route tree to work off, and not that much else to offer. South Carolina's Jalen Brooks also had some pretty bad testing numbers, including the worst 40 time for the position at 4.69 and its lowest 3-cone drill. Coming off just one season of fairly good production, he did at least hit the 6 foot and 200 pound mark in a very small wide receiver class, but your lack of athletic tools will only be highlighted by who's going up before and after you, and that was definitely not the class to be in. Next up we got the tight ends, and one of the easier choices of the entire list. How could it not be Old Dominion's Zach Kuntz? He was just 100th of a second in the 40 and 400th in the short shuttle away from sweeping the board for the tight ends. So to quickly bring up the numbers for this guy at 6'7", 255 pounds, a 4.55 in the 40, a 40-inch vert, a 10.8 broad jump, a 6.87 free cone, a 4.12 short shuttle, and 23 reps on the bench press. That's pretty insane. In terms of the on-field drills, I thought he could have gotten out of his breaks a little bit quicker maybe, but he is coming off an undisclosed injury that ended his season, where watching it again, he got his leg twisted underneath a tackler, so either an MCL sprain or an ankle probably, maybe still getting back to 100% confidence, being able to plant off that foot. Other than that, he consistently extended away from his frame and showed soft hands, along with instantly tucking the ball away, which was apparent with how easily he made it through the gauntlet. To be such an athletic outlier with high-level production when given a chance to contribute after transferring from Penn State, albeit against slightly lesser competition. This is a very strong tight end class to be fair, but this kid may have thrown his name in the ring as a surprise pick late on day 2. For as crafty as he is already and how well he catches the ball, Iowa's Sam Laporta running 4.59 at 245 pounds, having top 3 numbers in both the agility drills, and have fluidly looked on the field, not even breaking a sweat it felt like. That definitely helped him. And of course, just seeing the monstrous measurements of Georgia's Donald Washington, measuring with the largest wingspan of any tight end ever at the combine, running a 4.64 at 264 pounds, and that sick one-handed grab on a goal line fade, it puts you in awe. But maybe most impressive, his 4.08 in the short shuttle was the 3rd best time of the entire combine, and the 2 guys ahead of him were both less than 200 pounds. That is insane. There's not really one guy I feel worthy of being outlined here in a negative way, but since I did want to mention somebody at each position, I will go with a combination of 2 Cincinnati tight ends. Josh Wiley's 4.69 was below average for the group, along with having the 4.4 vertical jump at 33.5 inches, and he was tied for the worst broad at 9.7. Also having only 31.5 inch arms at 6.6.5 isn't great either. Running routes and catching the ball, he was thankfully able to make up for some of that. But meanwhile, Leonard Taylor, his former teammate, didn't take part in any of the testing, but his on-field workout simply wasn't very good. He wasn't crisp on a couple of breaks, and just the way he addressed the football down the field was poor. The first pass on a slot fade route slipped right through his hands because he didn't keep his pinkies together, and the same thing happened on the other side of the field later on more of a wheel route. To end the day, he made a nice looking pirouette catch on a goal line fade, but unfortunately we didn't survive the ground because he didn't pull the ball into his body in time. During the gauntlet was actually where he looked best in that regard. And trying to secure the title as tight end 1, especially with Utah's Dalton Kincaid not taking part, Notre Dame's Michael Mayer couldn't really put up any of the athletic marks that he'd like to see. A 4.7 flat in the 40 and just a 32.5 inch vert aren't really great endorsements. That has us moving on to the offensive line, starting at the tackle position, and this is a spot where I considered a couple of names, but I ultimately went with BYU's Blake Freeland. Whenever you break a record for your position, I believe he deserved to be mentioned on a list like this. And Freeland's 37-inch vertical jump is pretty insane for a guy just above the 300-pound threshold. He also hit the 10-foot mark for the broad jump, which was 5 inches better than the next closest offensive lineman, and he was just 100th of a second off the top mark in the 40 for that group, with a 4.98 to his name, while the more important 10-yard split at 1.68 led the group. Freeland's height did lead to him still being a little tall during the change of direction stuff in the on-field portion of the actual workout, but he did cover good ground with those long strides and pulls. There wasn't really any wasted movement, and you saw the explosiveness out of his stance a couple of times when getting out of pulls. I think at 6'8", my questions about pad level and ability to anchor and pass protection is still there, but in terms of athletic profile, the ceiling for him is sky high, and there's plenty of room upwards to counterbalance some of those problems that height may present to him. I promise you that's what every offensive line coach in the NFL is saying right now. A couple of other names to mention here. Broderick Jones from Georgia, probably the best 40 time among offensive linemen at the combine with a 4.97. He also looked well coordinated in his movement during the on-field drills and showed that burst and longer pulls. Plus he had a really fun finish to the workouts when he basically tossed one of the coaches aside as he released on a screen drill. And they didn't run, but Syracuse's Matthew Bergeron and Tennessee's Darnell Wright both had tremendous field workouts. So light-footed, changing directions, reacting to the coach's indications, and the speed when they were allowed to get on the move. They were both super impressive. As we get back to the Reds, I have to mention a small school prospect here, Mark Evans II from Arkansas Pine Bluff. Before I even got to any of the athletic testing, Evans' 32 and 3/8 inch arms probably will make him a guard only in most people's boards. However, he was listed at offensive tackle, and for that label, his 5.44 in the 40 was the second worst among the group, and the 10-yard split of 1.9 flat was actually ahead of only Ohio State's DeJuan Jones among all linemen, who weighs 71 pounds more than Evans at just about 300. I thought Evans actually looked solid during the on-field workouts, other than when he had to kind of bend his path on the fly, and I won't bang him too much for the performance, but especially for small school names like this, having some of the worst testing numbers, there's less motivation for higher-ranked guys in NFL organizations rather than the area scouts to get to and fall in love with his tape. Going back to the East-West Shrine practices, I noted that he had a couple of impressive reps of mirroring interior rushes laterally, which we also saw during the mirror drill in Indy, and I hope I can personally get to his tape by the time I put up my interior offensive line rankings, but even for me, that will probably push him behind a couple of other names on my personal watch list. Baylor's Connor Galvin was another guy that disappointed. First, at just 293 pounds, he was tied for the second worst 40 time among all players in Indy, and he also looked very skinny. I thought on tape he had some issues staying low and absorbing power, which continued to be question marks for me because he wasn't able to move around on the field with sufficient sink in his hips to make up for the lack of bulk. And something that has to be mentioned here is Northwestern stand-up Peter Skoronski, measuring him with just 32.25 inch arms, which may make him a guard only for some teams who have hard benchmarks, and the general one is 33 inches. Nothing Skoronski did in Indy actually hurt his stock otherwise. He performed well. It's just that one question that we all had now being answered. Going back to the risers now, there wasn't really as obvious a choice on the interior. I thought LSU's Anthony Bradford moved around really well during the on-field workout, and he was tied for the second best 10-yard split among the interior O-line, while Alabama's Emil Ekiyor continues to have a strong pre-draft process after showing the flexibility to play center at the Senior Bowl, just with the burst out of his stance and how well coordinated he looked in drills, even though he didn't test at all. Yet, I would be remiss to not talk about a guy here who I haven't studied yet, but definitely will now, and that's UCLA guard John Gaines II. I'm very familiar and fond with the play of the other Bruin guard, Antonio Mafi, who I highlighted after an awesome Shrine Bowl week, and I thought was a massive combine snub, but I didn't actively watch Gaines even, because based on consensus rankings, he's currently projected to go undrafted. That probably changed after the way he dominated the testing in Indy. Clemson's Jordan McFadden is officially labeled as a guard on NFL.com, but considering he always played tackle in college, I would just count him as such, which would give Gaines the best time in the 40-yard dash among the interior O-line, just 100th off the 5-second mark. His 1.73 10-yard split was tops for the group, and so were his 32.5 inch vert and the 9.6 broad jump. He also had the best times among all offensive linemen in both the agility drills, with the 4.45 and the 20-yard shuttle in particular being the best mark for the interior guy since James Daniels back in 2018. That explosiveness and ability to change directions also showed up on the field with an elite mirror drill, and his footwork looked so well coordinated. So I don't mind at all going back to the UCLA offensive line, and I'll have my eyes locked in on Gaines this time around before I give out any projections. However, we have to get back to a faller here, and this one was kinda rough to watch. Oregon's TJ Bass. His 5.48 in the 40 was tied for the second worst time among all players in Indy, while the 1.86 10-yard split was just 100th of a second better than the worst mark among interior O-line, and his 28.5-inch vert wasn't great either. I thought on the field in what they refer to as the wave drill, where a coach gives them directions, Bass looked clunky in his transitions, you saw his heels click, and he just wasn't able to move around very well with sinking his hips. Turning the corner on poles, there were some unnecessary steps and a lack of short area burst that you'd like to see. He also didn't really look comfortable stopping his feet to take the directions of the coach after coming around on lead and scoop pulls. At least the mirror drill looked pretty balanced, but I'm not sure if that was a twitchy interior rusher on the other side rather than a crouch across from him, that he would have been able to stay square to them with the ground that he covers laterally. He's just a heavy-footed guy, and I haven't studied individual Oregon O-linemen, but there's a lot of guys on day 3 in the interior that I like quite a bit, so I have a tough time seeing him be a name that'll be very high in my final rankings. Washington's Henry Bainivalu had the worst mark in the 40 and both the agility drills among players in Indy, but I actually thought he looked pretty damn good in the on-field stuff, so I won't drag him too much for it. And then just the guy that you have to feel bad for, USC's Andrew Voorhees, tearing his ACL during the workout. You never want to see anything like that. But then for him on the next day, with the brace on, to get to the bench and pump out 38 reps, which was the top mark on the entire combine, you'll have to see that, and I really hope that he doesn't fall too far and has a great future in front of him. But the final position now, running back. First and foremost, Texas A&M's Devon Achane we knew could fly, and the 4.32 he ran in the 40s great, but that was the expectation, as crazy as that sounds. Bijan Robinson from Texas had a great all-around workout, particularly with how naturally he caught the ball, and how he never seemed to be straining out there. However, my guy here is Alabama's Jahmyr Gibbs. When you look at different draft evaluations, the comparison you see over and over again is the Saints' Alvin Kamara, and I see a lot of that in Gibbs. But Kamara ran a 4.56 in the combine. Gibbs was 2 full tenths of a second faster than that, which put him behind only Achane among the running backs. Along with that, he just made the entire workout look effortless almost. So easy stepping over and navigating around the bags, not stuttering his feet or slowing himself down at all I felt like. Several running backs seemed to have issues with the Deuce Staley drill, and Gibbs just went through it as if he didn't even have to think about it. And then the reactionary suddenness to immediately cut as he got directions from the coaches. Maybe most telling about him as a player though, is what he did as a receiver. No wasted movement as he was running routes, clearly getting out of his breaks, never even a ball with the ball, and the only one he didn't catch was thrown by a scout once he sent off the throwing quarterbacks, where the ball was just a tad off, and of course did haul in the final wheel routes on the redo. Bijan has been RB1 all along, but this guy is firmly entrenched as the next guy I believe, and he still has a good chance of going late in the first if a contending team feels like they can maximize his skill set. UCLA's Zach Charbonnet is the third name in the discussion for me, and he checked another box I believe. His 4.53 in the 40 at 214 pounds is really good, and the 1.54 10-yard split especially is what you want to see. He was also 5th in the vert and 7th in the broad jump, and on the field he was effective with his cuts and caught the ball naturally. Our final guy that we have to highlight here in a negative way unfortunately is Sir Roderick Thompson from Texas Tech. He actually came in a bit lighter than expected at 207 pounds after the Red Raiders had him listed at 220, and he measured in half an inch short of 6 feet, with some of the smaller hands right at 9 inches. The testing across the board was subpar. His 4.67 in the 40 was ahead of only Utah's Tavian Thomas, who outweighs him by a full 30 pounds. Thompson was also bottom 5 in both the jumps, and surprisingly took part in both the agility drills, where the only running back to even follow suit was Northwestern's Evan Hull, who easily bested Thompson by more than 3/10 of a second in both. In fact, his 4.7 flat in the short shuttle was the worst mark of any non-offensive or defensive lineman at the entire event, with multiple of those guys in front of him too. He caught all the balls thrown his way and didn't stumble over his own feet or anything like that, but it does take a beat for him to turn upfield after catching the ball, and he didn't make any explosive cuts that would make you feel any better. Thompson had a solid Senior Bowl week after filling in for the other Texas running back, Rashawn Johnson, who got hurt on day 1, and you really have to admire the willingness to compete in all areas, but in an extremely deep running back class, a performance like this may get you undrafted. Cameron Peoples from App State also stepped on the backs and tripped over them a couple of times, looking overwhelmed a bit in the Deuce Daily drill in particular, where he didn't pick the right hole when the trainers indicated where he should go with the upright bags. He didn't drop any passes, but he clapped at the ball a few times and didn't have his hands aligned properly. In Mobile, I thought he caught the ball pretty well until a couple of blatant drops in the actual game. So with extremely limited receiving production in college, that's an area he'll need to prove himself to NFL teams still. And that's gonna do it. To quickly recap here, the guys I thought made some money for themselves. Interior defensive lineman Brian Brzee from Clemson. Sort of a tweener between edge and interior D-line, added Tumima Odubaware from Northwestern. Linebacker Shaka Hayward from Duke. Cornerback Deontay Banks from Maryland. Safety Tre'Tavious Martin from Illinois. Quarterback Anthony Richardson from Florida. Wide receiver Demario Douglas from Liberty. Tight end Zach Kuntz from Old Dominion. Offensive tackle Blake Freeland from BYU. Interior O-line John Gaines II from UCLA. And running back Jahmyr Gibbs from Alabama. And the guys who brought up some question marks: interior defensive lineman PJ Mustard from Penn State. Edge defender Isaiah Land from Florida A&M. Linebacker Jalen Graham from Purdue. Cornerback Jalen Jones from Texas A&M. Safety Brandon Joseph from Notre Dame. Quarterback Mike Stuggan from TCU. Wide receiver Dante Demas from Maryland. Tight end Josh Weil and Leonard Taylor from Cincinnati. Offensive tackle Mark Evans II from Arkansas Pine Bluff. Interior O-line TJ Bass from Oregon. And finally, running back Roderick Thompson from Texas Tech. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, hitting the subscribe button if you haven't yet, and maybe sharing it with a friend or two. I will consider it a personal favor. We're in full on draft mode now, of course, and I already put up a couple of articles on the biggest standouts from the college all-star events, which I already referenced a couple of times. And last week I kind of mapped out what the first round could look like, I believe, before we see storylines and narratives be created coming out of Indianapolis. The link to my page, hellosforfootballtalk.com, is down below in the video description, along with all my social media handles. There, I already mentioned what's about to come over the next 7 weeks, which is 2 positional draft rankings per week, and my guys episode here on YouTube, then my personal top 100 big boards, and finally my ultimate mock draft, once again in video form. So I'm just grinding over here and hope you enjoy all the content, because I really believe you won't find more detailed draft analysis anywhere out there. Hoping you all check back soon. So until then, see you later. Peace!